You're welcome. I've always found the real meaning of the parables hard to understand. The world is now having to face up to the indiscriminate and invisible challenge of COVID-19. So during the COVID shielding process in the past 2 weeks, I've been thinking about the Bible parables and asking some test questions. What do parables mean for us individually and collectively? Were they relevant 2,000 years ago? Are they relevant now? And will they be relevant in the future? My understanding is that although parables are fictitious stories, they present us with situations that are true to life. Parables contain elements of wisdom, making them, in some ways, more like the Old Testament Proverbs. Some count 100 parables in the Bible. Others see over 250. There are over 30 parables of Jesus recorded in what is known as the Synoptic Gospels, which are the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which describe events that are similar to the point of view and contrasted with that of John. The Gospel of John has no parables. Unlike this talk, all the parables are very short, and some are very brief. As we discovered last week, parables often place two concepts, one known, the other unknown, side by side for comparison. They use the known concept, like the work of the farmer planting seeds, to explain the central truth about the less familiar concept, like the people's understanding of the Word of God. Like last week, my talk was based on the parable of sowing seeds. You will recall I spoke about our experience at home with growing tomatoes. I've used the parable storytelling technique, and I related it to myself as a soil type to characterize the faith that I currently have. My soil type was fundamental to how effective the seed germinated and grew. In last week's talk, the seed was a metaphor for the Word of God. Unlike last week's talk, the emphasis this week's parable is focused on the good seed. It's not focused on the good seed, but it's focused on the bad seed. The bad darnel seed was sown alongside the good seed sown by Satan in the same ground. I've discovered from my personal experience of my work in chemistry that balance has to be maintained to create stability. Good must be balanced with evil, otherwise we can have no appreciation of what good and evil are. Perhaps this is the meaning of this week's parable. So, what is good and evil? Or put another way, what is good and bad seed? Logic suggests that seed is seed. I've been banned by the head gardener from weeding at home because I can't tell weeds from plants. In my view, weeds are just plants in the wrong place. We know in the parable that the darnel seed was sown maliciously to spoil the crop of wheat. The weeds referred to in the parable this week are specifically darnel, which is a weed related to ryegrass. In the early stages of growth, darnel has the same habit and looks like wheat. The darnel seed would not be readily apparent until the plants began to form ears. Hence, the weeds became visible at the same time that the wheat was about to produce a crop or a harvest. By that time, it was too late to eradicate the darnel seed without damaging the wheat. The darnel grains are poisonous, so to have that mixed with the wheat renders the crop commercially useless and potentially harmful. In this parable, it's not the darnel seed that's bad, it's the willful intent of the sower that is evil. So why is COVID-19 so difficult to control? Well, like the darnel seed, the COVID-19 virus goes undetected in the early stages of development. In fact, Some people are infectious and carry the disease without showing symptoms. Unless they have been tested positive, the asymptomatic people can't possibly show any evil intent by passing on the virus. Nevertheless, the fact always remains that we must stay alert and take effective measures to stop the spread of the virus. The consequences, if we do not, will be like the darnel seed being mixed with the wheat. The COVID-19 virus will become a mass killer. Viruses are very simple structures. They aren't even a full cell. Viruses only have two components: a protein outer shell, which contains the core DNA or RNA genetic material. DNA or RNA is a molecule that contains the instructions an organism needs to develop, live, and reproduce. Unlike bacteria, viruses can't survive without a host. They can only reproduce by attaching themselves to other living cells. In most cases, they reprogram the host cell that they are attached to, and they make new viruses until the host cell bursts and dies. Viruses are small. They're very small, smaller than bacteria. In fact, the largest virus is smaller than the smallest bacterium. Virions, which is the small single virus particle, and that's what it's called, are so small they are measured in a measurement known as nanometers. The average diameter of a COVID-19 virus particle is around 120 nanometers, which is equivalent to 12 microns. I wish our hairdresser friend was here to listen to this, because I'm going to equate this to hair. Often we characterize hair as thick or thin. The diameter of the human hair ranges between 17 and 181 microns. The average hair is approximately 80 microns in diameter. So approximately 45 COVID-19 virons or particles can cover the end of a human hair. It gives you an idea of how small they are. So knowing this information, it's no wonder to me how COVID particles can become airborne and spread between people. In today's parable, we are contrasting good and bad. When I was working, I had responsibility for running a Japanese international business, which meant I made many business trips to Japan. Greater Tokyo has a mind-boggling population of 37 million people, and for most of them, the only way to get around is on the city's notoriously packed train network. The Japanese government's COVID policy was to request a short period of voluntary, I emphasize voluntary lockdown. In Japan, they have an elderly population. So I asked myself a test question. Why haven't more people died in Tokyo from COVID-19 when compared to London? Greater London has a population of 8.5 million people. It's a very complex question, I know, but from my own experience, I can tell you that the big difference that stands out to me is that the Japanese people are very compliant. They are very polite and considerate towards each other. This means they take responsibility for their actions and are always alert in all settings to take care of their actions, that they don't impact or affect other people. I just wonder if this is the reason why they have many fewer deaths in Tokyo than we have in London. So does the parable today offer us any comfort? I had to cope with the Lehman financial shock in 2008, which was a very difficult time for business. It created long-lasting and damaging negative economic and social effects. For the past 10 years, austerity has had an impact on many of my friends. In my opinion, the damage caused in 2008 will appear trivial when compared to the economic disruption that COVID-19 is predicted to cause on a global basis. I believe, as a consequence of the effects of COVID, that people will come to church in increasing numbers. They will be looking for help when they have nobody else to turn to. Today, tens of thousands of people are already unemployed, but they don't realize it yet. Imagine the economic consequences for many more people caused by going without pay because of the requirements to self-isolate. One thing piled on top of another until people are overwhelmed with hardship. People will feel victimized. Some people may say, how can God let this happen? Others may say, what have I done to deserve this? This does not even start to consider the people who become seriously ill as a direct consequence of the virus. What the darnel see grains that render the wheat crop economically valueless in the parable, COVID-19 is obviously having a harmful impact on the world's economy. For me, the moral of the parable is in the last verse, which assures us that in the end, good will triumph over bad. It tells us in verse 43, righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of the Father. And so, in closing, I ask another of my test questions. Do parables relate to our present day crisis? Logic would suggest that the Bible being based on events more than 2,000 years ago, that Christ's parables are devised to be timeless in their relevance. This brings us to the troubling weeds. Why shouldn't we pull them out if we see evil choking the good that's around it? Why does Jesus say, leave the weeds alone until the harvest? There might be some plausible explanations for leaving the weeds alone. Sometimes weeds are too big to be pulled out, or have their roots intertwined with other good plants. Pulling up one will also uproot the other. As Barbara knows, sometimes what I thought was a bad weed was a good plant, and what I thought was a good plant was a bad weed. They aren't always easily to distinguish one from another. This is true in life in general. We aren't good at judging between good and bad. In life, that's God's job anyway. And that brings us back to those test questions I asked at the start of the talk. What do parables mean for us individually and collectively? Does the parable of the weeds give us any hope for the future? Does today's gospel reading provide comfort for those suffering from the effects of COVID-19 pandemic? And so finally, we learn from today's parable that when it is time for the wheat crop to be harvested, the bad darnel seed is dealt with first. The consequence is that some of the good wheat grain will be lost. We see the same in life, with many good people dying prematurely from COVID-19. Why God allows bad to exist alongside good that's scattered around the world is beyond me. Maybe it's just a matter of balance. We must experience bad to be able to appreciate good. What I do know is it is only by God's grace that Barbara and I have the life that we share together. We may be in the high risk category when it comes to COVID-19, which means we must continue to shield ourselves to improve our chances of survival. But it doesn't mean that we have to be alone. After all, we have Christ's promise in Matthew chapter 28, verse 20. I am with you always, even until the end of the world. According to today's parable, in the end, the Lord will decide to dispense grace. He will send his angels to cast on the fire of hell all who have evil intent. And that, for me, is the meaning behind the weeds parable in today's gospel reading. Thank you.